A top 10 matchup inside the Bob lived up to all the hype as Nebraska and Purdue battled it out in a back-and-forth matchup all night long.
Sarah Rodriguez controls it. Riley's going to back set Beeson. One-arm dig by Rodriguez, jousted the net, won by the Huskers. And Andy Jackson terminates her 8th kill of the night.
Welcome in to She Scores, a Women in Sports focused podcast. I'm your host, Sarah Pearson. Welcome in to another episode of She Scores. No special guest on today's episode, it's just me, so I thought I would share a little bit about my story because you may be wondering, why is this girl qualified to do a podcast about sports media and women working in sports? Well, I am one of those women working in sports, so I thought I would share a little bit about my story and kind of how I got to where I'm at today. So what kind of really started everything was when I was 7 years old, I went to my first ever Nebraska volleyball game, and ever since then I knew that volleyball, that was going to be a part of my life, and the Huskers that's kind of where everything started. So then that following year when I was 8, I started playing volleyball. And that lit a spark in me. I'm like, I want to be a Nebraska volleyball player. Like, I'm going to be the next Jordan Larson. And for the longest time, that's really what I thought was going to be my life. But then, I realized in about 8th or 9th grade that I'm like, Sarah, you're 5 feet tall. Like, you're not athletic. Like, you're not going to make it at that level. So I really wanted to figure out how can I still be involved in sports even though I'm not playing. So in high school, I started getting involved in the sports media realm. I started with the sports reporting. So what I did was our school had kind of a weekly news show, and I did the sports report. I called it Storm Center, little play on Sports Center because our mascot was a storm. And so I did that all 4 years of high school. I cut up highlights, I put the music over it, I talked about the games, but it was really my senior year of high school when our teacher asked, hey, does anybody want to start broadcasting the games? We want to get students to start doing that. And I immediately raised my hand. I'm like, I knew that was something I wanted to do. And I remember that very first football game, our team wasn't very good, but that very first football game, it was a bad game. We were down 50-0 in the first quarter. And as soon as our team scored that very first touchdown and I had that call, I'm like, okay, this is it. This is going to be my life. So then it was just a question of, okay, what do I major in? Because I already knew I wanted to go into UNL. I've wanted to be a Husker my entire life. So going to UNL and being a Husker still was a dream come true. So it was just like, what do I major in? And I remember sitting at my kitchen table, scrolling, on the University of Nebraska-Lincoln website, scrolling through until I saw sports media. And I'm like, I was reading the description and broadcasting, journalism, photo, video, all that stuff. And I'm like, I've literally done everything up until this point in high school. I did the anchoring, I called the games, I did... I was on yearbook, I took photos, so really I had experience in all these different fields, and so I'm like, this is perfect. And so I was like, okay, that's it, decision made, that's what I'm doing. And I remember my junior year when we had the, apply for college day at my school, and I remember my mom was like, Sarah, you should apply for some other schools, just in case. And I'm like, no, I am set. If I'm not going to UNL, my life is over, I don't know what I would do. And so that's where I applied. I think there was a couple other places where if you send it to UNL, it automatically sent it to 2 other places, but I knew that's where I wanted to go. And so then it was just the waiting, did I get in? Did I get in? And I remember specifically, ironically, I was in the digital media class, kind of where everything, started, and I was sitting there in the chair, and I remember getting the email that's saying you've been accepted to UNL, and I was freaking out, and I was so excited. So at that point, it was really okay, I'm in, can I be done with high school now and go to college now? Because I've wanted to be a Husker my whole life, and it was finally coming true. And I think a lot of people do hit that point in senior year where they're just like, I'm done with high school. And I was definitely at that point. Honestly, I couldn't wait to graduate. So then we finally get to the end of the year, and I'm like, okay, just a few more months until I get to go to UNL. And I think that was like the longest summer of my life. I was just waiting and waiting and waiting. And finally we get to like August, middle of August. I don't remember the day exactly, but I remember that very first day just getting in the car, driving down the Lincoln for moving day, and I was just like so giddy I couldn't stop smiling. So yeah, that's a little bit of kind of growing up a fan, wanting to be a Husker volleyball player. That's kind of how I got to college. Now I want to transition a little bit into kind of what I'm doing in college now. So, I came to college very first day, square one. They always say do from day one. That's kind of the saying here at the Coach AMC. And I was ready to hit the ground running. I remember coming into the experience lab, that like intro first class is kind of like where you figure out what you want to do. I kind of already knew what I wanted to do. Well, maybe not specifically, but I at least knew I wanted to work in sports. And I think, like, the people that were in charge of that, I think they were impressed with, like, how much I had already done. Because, like, a lot of people coming into this experience lab really haven't done a lot. Because, and this is kind of, like, where you figure that out. And I'm like, oh, I've already done this and this and this. I guess that was one good thing about going, about high school was I went to a really small high school. So I got to do quite a bit of stuff. So I think that really helped me as I transitioned into college because I kind of already had that background and I wasn't like starting from complete scratch. So that very first week, I remember they asked me to run the board for a Nebraska volleyball game. And I immediately start freaking out. I'm like, oh my gosh, I get to do stuff for Husker volleyball. And I thought that's what I was going to be in the stadium. So I was like freaking out. But when they told me I was going to be in the studio here, then I was like, oh, man. But I'm like, you got to start somewhere, right? So I remember I took a selfie. I had my Husker volleyball sweatshirt on because, I was only in the studio. And I remember I was like, took a picture of it and posted it on social media. And I remember my, I guess now former principal at where I went to high school, he shouted me out on Twitter. And I was like, that's pretty cool. It was a couple weeks later when I was sitting in the stands at a Nebraska soccer game. And I was there with my parents, and I remember sitting there. I remember getting an email, and it was like, do you want to call the Nebraska soccer game in 2 weeks? And I was like, oh my gosh, like, I'm literally a freshman. I've been here 2 weeks, and I'm already going to be on the air. Like, I remember back when I went on tour, they told me that. They're like, oh, it's going to be like a few weeks and you'll be on air. And I'm like, oh, I don't believe you. Yeah, sure. Maybe by the end of the semester. But they weren't kidding. And so I remember I replied to that email all in caps. And I was like, oh my gosh, yes. So we get to that first game and I'm like freaking out. I'm so nervous. And I don't remember who it was, but I remember the person I did it with. We were driving to the stadium. And he asked me, he's like, what year are you? You sophomore, junior? And I'm like, I'm a freshman. And I was just like, I basically couldn't stop smiling the whole night. And I didn't really talk much that first game because, like, I was freaking out. I'm like, oh my gosh, like, this is the coolest thing ever. So I did that first game, super fun. And I remember it was just like a few days after the game where I got a message and it's like, did you enjoy doing the game? And I'm like, yeah, of course. And he's like, would you want to do it again? I'm like, yeah. And so then I get a message back. We have an opening to do color for Nebraska volleyball on Sunday. And this was like Friday night. Can you do it? They're like, I know it's last minute notice, but like, I know you know Husker volleyball very well. Would you like to do it? And I'm like, I had to go outside and like scream because I'm like, this is literally the dream. Like, broadcasting Husker volleyball, I'm like, this is literally what I want to do, like, for my future job. And I'm like, oh my gosh, yes. So that was, like, really cool. I'm like, oh my gosh, like, I'm a freshman. I haven't even been here that long, and I'm already getting to, like, do what I want to do for the rest of my life. Like, I couldn't believe it. Again, that volleyball game, I really didn't talk a lot because it's funny. I go back now and like listen to my games now compared to that, and it's like, oh my god, that was so cringe. But little freshman me, I was just nervous, and don't really get nervous anymore because, I've had a lot of experience and reps on the air. But that first semester freshman year, I was still in that like, oh my gosh phase. But now it's kind of like, all right. So really, as the years have progressed here in college, I've just gotten to do more and more and more. And I could have never imagined as much as I've gotten to do. Like, I've broadcasted all these games over the air. I've done video at games, I've done photo, I've done writing, I've done basically just a little bit of everything. And I want to talk a little bit about some of the favorite games that I've gotten to cover here at my time at Nebraska. Freshman year, we had an all-female football crew for the Nebraska spring game, and that was the first time that would ever happen, and it was really cool. And I personally didn't think it was going to be that big of a deal because I thought we were just going to be shoved in the booth in the corner. Like, I'm the spotter. I'm like, this isn't important, right? And I remember we went down on the field and the reporter from BTN wanted to like talk to us and do this story on us. And I'm like, oh my gosh, like, this is awesome. And I remember my uncle who lives in Florida, he like took a picture of the TV and like sent it to me. And it was like, you're on BTN. I was like, okay, this is actually really cool. So that was kind of like, I guess, one of my highlights of freshman year. And then going into sophomore year, I guess this would have been second semester, around April. Nebraska volleyball actually came close to my hometown. So like, I'm from Polk, Nebraska, and then the next town is like Central City, which is like 15 minutes away. But that's kind of where everything started because that's where I started playing volleyball, way back when I was 8 years old. And they were coming there, and I was like, oh my gosh, I have to go. But then, like, to get tickets, you had to be there in person. And I'm like, it was in the middle of the day, in the middle of the school year. So I'm like, how's that going to work? So I'm like, the only way I'm going to get it to go is if I get credentialed. So I remember they announced it in, like, February. I immediately texted my professor. I'm like, I want to cover this game. Like, it needs to happen. And I remember constantly, like, every 2 weeks, I was like, did you get my credential? Like, am I doing this? Is this happening? I constantly reminding him. And I remember it was like a week before the game. I was walking to class, and I got the email that said, like, your credential has been approved. And I was like, oh my gosh. And so I know as a member of the media, you're supposed to be neutral, but I did a pretty good job. That was really hard because I'm like, it was kind of a full circle moment. Like, this is where it all started, and now I'm back here covering the Huskers. And I remember I was doing a really good job of, like, staying neutral throughout the day. But I remember I guess it was towards the beginning of the game, my dad came over and he was like, John Cook is wearing your grandpa's cowboy boots. That's a whole nother story in itself, maybe for another time. But I was like, oh my gosh. So I had to get video of it. And I remember at the very end, I'm still staying pretty cool. And John Cook was like, shout out to Sarah's grandpa. And I was like, I smiled. I broke a little bit there, started smiling. And at the very end of the game when we were doing the interviews, one of the reporters was like, so what's the story with the cowboy boots? And then I just started smiling because I was like, oh my gosh, this is really cool. Junior year, I would say my favorite game that I covered was the Nebraska women's basketball game versus Iowa. That was just like so much fun because Nebraska had not ever beaten Iowa. And it was funny because, Caitlin Clark, she was going for like the all-time scoring record, big shot. ESPN was there. Everyone's like, she's going to break the record. So, like, it was a big deal. Nobody thought Nebraska was going to win that game. Now, my personal Husker heart in the back of my mind was like, oh my gosh, we're going to do this. We're going to do this. And I remember walking into the arena, and just that Lincoln Bridge was just lined up with fans. And some of the fans, mostly Iowa, were like, we've been here since 4 a.m. And I'm like, oh my gosh. I mean, to be fair, I am crazy like that too. But, not that day. And so we walk in, and it's like, it is just like, you could feel the energy in the building. And as much as I would have loved to been on play-by-play for that, I think it's a good thing I wasn't, because I was kind of internally losing it. But I was just doing like the pregame, postgame show. So that was still really cool to be a part of that. And I remember going down on the court to do like my pregame stand-up, and Holly Rowe walks by. And, I guess, that's kind of a point I'm doing this podcast, trying to meet different women working in sports. And Holly Rowe, if you're listening to this and want to be a guest, hit me up. But yeah, I remember walking up to her and I was like, no, she's too good, like too important. And I'm like, Sarah, this is your only chance. So I walked up to her and got a picture with her. That was really cool. And then I remember after the game, going down and like doing my little recap at the end of the game. And I'm like, I couldn't stop smiling because I was like, we just beat Iowa. Like, let's go. And so yeah, that was just really cool. And then flash forward to like later in junior year, second semester, I have 2 games that really stuck out. The first one is Nebraska softball when Billy Andrews tied the all-time record for career home runs. That was my first time getting to do play-by-play on BTN Plus. And I remember that whole last week I was doing stuff on the radio and I'm like, she hadn't hit it, she hadn't done it, or if she did hit a home run, it was when I was doing color. So I was like, please, Billy, like, if you're going to do it today. And do it, like, during the 3rd and 4th innings when I'm on play-by-play. And when she came up to the plate, and I was like, oh, my gosh, is it going to happen? And she hit that ball. And surprisingly, my call, I was proud of my call. I would say I got excited, but didn't go too over the top. But then when Nebraska, like, posted that on social media, I'm like, that's my voice behind that. So that was pretty cool. And then the second game, also softball, when Nebraska was playing Iowa, it's a doubleheader. I'm by myself, so I'm like, I have full range here. First game, walked it off. I think it was bottom of the 8th. It was just like an RBI. So I got pretty excited. We won on a walk-off. But the second game, we won on a walk-off again, but this time it was a home run. So walk-off home run. Obviously, I'm going ballistic. Maybe it was a little bit too over the top. I'll let you be the judge of that. Bradwell smokes that one deep into the left field, and the ball is gone! Huskers walk it off for the second time today off the bat of Ava Bradwell. The 2-run bomb ends it for the Cornhuskers! So now that I've talked a little bit about my favorite games that I've covered over the years, I'm going to close this out. I know this episode was a little bit shorter, but I am talking by myself and don't have anyone to go off of. So we're going to wrap things up a little bit here with my dream job. So my dream job is I want to call Nebraska volleyball on either the TV or the radio. Calling volleyball on BTN, that would be awesome. But ultimately, by my final job, I want to be calling Husker volleyball on the radio. Like, I want to be the next John Baylor. And so, yeah, that's the ultimate goal. Hopefully I can get there someday. It's hard to believe that I'm already in my senior year of college. Like, we end the semester here in 5 weeks. It's crazy how fast it's gone. Like, I remember, coming down here to college, I was so excited, that very first day, and now I'm about to graduate. Like, I'm not ready to leave, but, I hope that all this experience that I've had here in college can hopefully help me land a play-by-play job or any sports media job after graduation. But, yeah, so thank you so much for listening. I promise next episode we'll be back, regular format with the guests. Not sure who I'm going to have on next, but hopefully you keep tuning into that. So yeah, thank you so much for listening, and we'll see you next time. This has been She Scores. Thank you for listening. Tune in Mondays at noon to hear from more women changing the game.